Hey there, good evening. Welcome to Prog Monster. My name is Murph and I am the host of this show. This is a show that's dedicated to progressive rock and other forms of rock music. So we're here on Sunday night with Ben's album challenge. Once again, Ben has presented me with an album that is a bit of a challenge. But I've discovered with his albums, unlike the series I'm doing where I only do the one listen, that usually what happens is after the first couple of listens, when I do the final listen, in which case today I did 3 listenings and I did one earlier in the week too. Once I get to the third one, I'm hearing a lot of stuff I didn't hear early on, and for the most part I'm liking it more. I can't recall any instance during this whole challenge that I've listened to an album once and didn't like it better by the third time. It hasn't happened yet. Maybe it won't, hopefully. Anyways, for you new people who have not seen any of these, it's basically my friend Ben gives me an album every week that he picks. So far, almost none of them I've heard before. It's a little bit different today. I've heard this album before, but only once in the past. I remember listening to it online. It's been a while though. And I didn't think anything of it. Because to me it sounded like Time and a Word, and for a bit of it, there are some similarities between the two albums, and I'll get into that in a few minutes. But for those of you who haven't seen this video before, what I do is once he gives me the album, I listen to it 2 or 3 times and then give my opinion of the album, and at the same time I give him the song I like the best, which is what he's asked to do. So here we go. So I'm going to speak about generalities about this album at first, and then I'll go into the specific tracks after. So overall, there's a very Time and a Word sounding to this album. For those of you who are not familiar with what that is, Time and a Word was Yes's second album, which was also the last album that Peter Banks was on. And Peter Banks was the former of this band, and this band is called Flash. This album is their debut album. So that's the album we're doing today. Flash's debut album. So Peter Banks, of course, was the guitarist for Yes for the first 2 albums. The one just simply titled Yes, and then the second album called Time and a Word. Then he went off on his own and formed this band called Flash. And this is their debut album. Also appearing on this album, but he never accepted membership to the group. I think he was probably offered it, but decided that he had his own project in mind, and that is keyboardist Tony Kaye. So because of Tony Kaye and because of Peter Banks, there's a very Time and a Word sounding to this album. It's as heavy as that album. Instrumentally, it's not too far off. Like most of the people in the band aren't too far out of place against their counterparts, and I'm sorry if I'm comparing these 2 albums to each other, but there are some similarities here, and I wanted to address it before I went on. Of course, the 2 main similarities that you have the same guitar player and the same bass player here, and both are pretty dominant. From listening to this album, what it tells me is how much of an influence Peter Banks especially had on Yes at that time period. I think he left the band because of musical disagreements on the direction. John Anderson and probably some of the other members wanted to go in a certain direction that they wanted to take, and he didn't want to go in that direction. So I think that's what happened. So he formed this band, and it's pretty clear that the direction he wanted to go in was more similar to Time and a Word, I think. What you get here is an album similar, but this one is more progressive. I think it has more progressive elements. There's a lot more guitar, I think, here, and the keyboards are a little more frontal here as well, whereas in that Time and a Word album, the bass and the drums were a lot more frontal there, and that stands to reason because you have Bill Bruford and Chris Squire on those parts, very frontal type musicians. Anyways, so that to me is the similarities between the 2, and I have to admit, I like Peter Banks. I think he's a good guitar player. But I'm kind of glad that they separated and went their separate way. Not because I think he's a bad guitarist and wasn't going to fit the band, but Yes went on to do the next album they did with Steve Howe was the Yes album, and then Fragile, and then Close to the Edge. I don't see Peter Banks fitting into that scenario very well, and I think that the direction that they Yes went in, they wouldn't have went in if he was in the band, and I happen to love those three albums. So I'm glad that they separated and did their own things. And this stuff isn't bad either. So anyways, other than the similarities, which I wanted to address right away, because I will be mentioning some things that are similar throughout the thing, but I want to merit the album on its own strengths as well. So the first song, which is called Small Beginnings, the tracks are a little overall are a little longer on this album than they were on Time and a Word as well. One other thing about that is that there's more jazzy and bluesy stuff in this than there was in Time and a Word as well. I think that's it as far as the comparisons go. I can't think of any offhand. But, oh yeah, the one last thing is, on Time and a Word, there's a couple of tracks I really quite like a lot. And then there's a bunch of stuff that's a bit unmemorable. And there's a couple tracks I don't really care for at all. There's not that on this album. There isn't any really dominating tracks at this point because it's new. But most of the stuff's pretty solid. There's no real bad songs on this album. Songs that I just want to skip. I don't have that here with this album. So those are the kind of obvious comparisons between the two albums. So Time and the Word is not one of my favorite Yes albums, and so I'm kind of glad that they went in a different direction. Okay, so Small Beginnings is the opening track. It's about 9 minutes long. There's a few fairly lengthy tracks on his. This one, the third song, and the fourth song are all over 9 minutes long, with the fourth song being almost 13 or more. Okay, it's a very, like I said, a very Time and a Word sounding song. This particular track would fit on that album, and it would not be out of place in the slightest. Some nice drum bits in this particular track too. I think the drummer is pretty decent, and the keys, of course, lend to that Yes sound because Tony Kaye is doing his similar key styles there. I'm not a huge fan of Tony Kaye. I'm sorry, Tony. I'm not. Nothing against you. I think part of it isn't his abilities as much as I'm not a big fan of the Hammond organ. At least the style of Hammond organ they had in the early 70s. I was never a huge fan of it. I'm still not a huge fan of it. And there's a lot of it here, and that's probably my biggest issue with Tony Kaye is that Hammond organ thing. But his piano parts I have no problem with, and any other keyboard parts that he does I don't mind as well. But for some reason I'm just not a big fan of that particular instrument. The vocalist is different here. He both is within the same range of vocal sounds as John Anderson, but not really. Doesn't really sound like him. And then there's songs here where he's much lower and very distinctive. And when you hear those songs, you know clearly it isn't John Anderson. For some people who may not be as familiar with John Anderson and this guy, they might think they're the same guy at first. They might. But for those people who listen to Yes and then listen to this, they'll know the difference immediately. So those are the main things that make this song kind of stand like it could fit on that album easily. It's a good song. I think overall the melody and the sound of this song is pretty good. It's dated, it has a bit of a dated sound to it, but it comes from 50 years ago, so it's bound to be. The second song is about the same. I gave the first one a 6. I give this one a 6 too. More of a little bit of a bluesy poppy sound to it. There's a little more of that in here than you see in the first track. The vocals are a little lower range, and that shows the difference in this guy's voice. In the lower range, he doesn't sound anything like John Anderson. In the upper range, he does have some of those similar qualities. The guitar is very good on this track, I think. And it's more acoustic as well, which is nice. You see that he has a very acoustic range. Peter Banks does, I believe. He's not completely dissimilar in his musical preferences and taste of Steve Howe, but I don't know that he's up to that level, but he's still pretty damn good. Then we're going to move into the third track, which is Children of the Universe. This track I found to be another one that sounds like that album, and I didn't really care for it at the beginning, but I warmed up to it quite a bit here. And it opens with some pretty heavy guitar and keyboards here, and it's like a bit of a heavy pop song, but it sounds a bit dated. The guitars are the guitars fit in here, and the vocals fit in here very well, but it's like I said, it sounds a little bit dated. I do like the headphone guitar riffs that he does. At some point in the song, he does this thing where you can hear the guitar moving from left to right, and if you were listening with your headphones, you'd hear that going back and forth. And that's actually not that dissimilar from the Yes album, where Steve Howe does that that part in It's Yours Is No Disgrace, where he does that bum 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 bum. It goes back and forth between your ears. That's a similar part here. It's a very similar part here. The synthesizers sound interesting. I like the sound of them here. They're not bad. Overall, this is a pretty good tune. I gave it a 7. Probably barely gave it a 7, but I gave it a 7 nevertheless. So the next track is probably my favorite on the album because it's different than anything else. They start to go off in a different direction from the Time and a Word, which is good because I was never a huge fan of Time and the Word, like I said. So if it's an album sounds like it's going to be the same, right? I didn't really want that, so I was glad to see they went here. So this is it starts out with a classical acoustic guitar bit, which is tasteful. I like it. Tony Kaye is typical in his opening with his heavy parts here, so that part is similar. Then you have this real kind of jazzy bit around about the 5-minute mark of the song, and that jazzy bit goes on for about 3 or 4 minutes. So it goes about 8 minutes, maybe 8.5 minutes, and it includes like the guitar especially is very jazzy here. The bass and the drums are in the background, giving that jazz flair to it. Even the piano, I think, on this part is pretty jazzy as well, which is different from anything else they do on the album up till this point. Some really good vocal bits here by this guy. I think his name is Carter. I'm not sure. I think I seen a stat for him saying he was the vocalist. He's pretty decent. And then there's some heavy guitar riffing towards the end with this really good intricate solo. And then he does this part right at the end where it's a bit of a distortion heavy guitar riff, which is almost psychedelic, almost Hendrix-like, not to that extreme, but in that direction, and very tastefully done solo. It's maybe the best part of the whole album, I think, and that's the reason why it's probably my favorite, is because that part is very different than anything else on the album, and I liked it quite a bit. I gave the song a 7, but it's probably a little bit of a higher 7, maybe like a 7.5 over the other song. Then we have the final track, which is very different as well. It's more mellow. The vocals are medium to high range, so he's not singing in the Anderson stratosphere, but he's not singing in the low stratosphere that he does on a couple of other tracks. He's kind of in the middle somewhere. It's just a mellow song. It's not really comparable to anything. It's not a great track. I gave it a 5. It's probably to me it's the least memorable track. See, a lot of the rankings for me is memorability. If I can't remember the song, it's pretty hard to give it anything over a 5. And it's just pretty much unmemorable song. It's not a bad song though. I don't think it's bad. I wouldn't turn it off or anything. I wouldn't go there just to listen to it. So it's a pretty solid album from top to bottom. I don't think it's one of the best albums we've done here, but we've done some pretty solid albums. And the rate and the viewing shows that, because I'm over 100 views on just about every album that Ben's given me in the challenge. This one is a solid one. If you like that yes, that time and a word sound, if you like some of the stuff on the Yes album, this is probably a really good listen for you. And it's a good album. A lot of people, I think, probably like this album, but I just don't think it's terribly memorable. If it was, the radio stations would be eating it up, and they've pretty much eliminated anything that wasn't top 40 from them now, unfortunately. So an album like this would never stand a chance anymore, unfortunately. But it's still a pretty solid album, and once I finished this, I actually listened to a little bit of their next album, and it's even heavier and less keyboards, so it's often even more of a direction kind of away from Yes. And I think that Peter Banks is a very strong personality and very opinionated about what he wanted to play, and because it's quite dominantly sounding like him on both of those two albums, and to me that just shows how much influence he did carry. So at any rate, really solid album, definitely a passable album, definitely an album if I see it and it ain't breaking the bank, that I will definitely buy this one. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed this Ben's album challenge of the debut album of the band Flash from 1972. Great album. So please like and subscribe if you enjoyed this. We'll be back next week with another album. He's already sent me the links for it. I just haven't really looked at them. I did read that he wrote something about it being an Australian iconic band, or something that's common in Australia, or something to that effect. So I'm looking forward to seeing what that's all about, and we'll be back again next week with that album. So please enjoy your evening, and I hope you enjoyed this. Take care. See you tomorrow, or see you next week.